Luke Calder had read the letter until the paper went thin at the folds. A neat Eastern hand had promised a woman named Eleanor Pike, sensible and kind, arriving on the noon coach out of Abilene. He stood at the Dry Willow station with his hat in both hands, ring box in his pocket, and a sentence rehearsed so many times it had no bark left. The coach came in on a skein of dust and harness jingle. When it settled, the door swung open and the station gave a little hush, the kind it saves for newborns, funerals, and trouble. 3 women stepped down. All 3 wore travel dirty dresses and men's trail coats cut small. Hair pinned tight, faces set. They carried 2 canvas satchels between them in a small lacquered box bound in red cord. Their eyes tracked together, quick and alert. Not one of them was Eleanor Pike. Luke's sentence died in his mouth. Henderson, who ran the freight counter in Everybody's News, let out a soft, "Huh." 2 boys by the water trough forgot to pretend and stared. The driver tipped his hat toward Luke. "You Luke Calder?" "Yes," Luke managed. "Then I reckon these were pointed your way." He hopped back to his box as if the air near the coach had gone too warm to stand in. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward. She was not tall by ranch standards, but the kind of compose that makes a body seem larger. She took a breath, gathered courage like a shawl, and held out a folded paper. Chinese characters marched across it in black strokes like fence posts, a name in English tucked at the bottom, Calder, Willow Draw. Luke pointed at the letters and then at his chest. "Luke Calder," he said, slow. He lifted the envelope that had come from the boarding agency. "Eleanor Pike?" Blank looks. The smallest of the 3, delicate, quick hands, a thin white scar across one knuckle, pulled a second slip from her coat. Another address in English, the same name. Wrong language, right destination. "Do you speak English?" Luke asked, hearing the uselessness as it left him. All 3 shook their heads at once. The smallest pressed fingertips to her lips and shook again, then touched her ear and shook a 3rd time. Not deaf. She had heard him, but outside the fence of his words. Henderson drifted closer with a smile that held more story than welcome. "Agency's getting sloppy," he said to the air. "Folks come labeled like freight and still end up in the wrong barn." More faces turned. A ranch hand from the North Place smirked like men do when somebody else trips. Widow Malley's mouth pursed into a pin. The station master studied a timetable that hadn't changed since last winter. The women kept their eyes on Luke. The tallest, later he would learn her sisters called her Leon, set the lacquered box at her feet and put both palms against it, as if to anchor the moment. The other 2, May and Shu, though no one knew yet, stood just behind her shoulders, edges touching. They spoke to one another in low syllables, quick as creek water over rock. The sound was soft, but it carried the certainty of a language that had practiced surviving being ignored. Luke swallowed, lifted his hands in a useless, earnest way that meant "I don't know, but I want to." "Eleanor," he tried again. "1." He held up a finger, feeling foolish. Then he gestured gently to them. 3. Shu, the smallest, counted his finger. Hers, hers, hers. 3. She nodded. Then she pointed to the address again, to the red cord on the box, to the road that ran past the cottonwoods toward Willow Draw. She looked at Luke and lifted her chin a fraction. The question in her eyes was plain enough. "Is this yours? Are we safe if we follow it?" A horse clinked a bit. Sheriff Ames stepped out of the station shade with the slow caution of a man who had seen dust settle both ways. He looked from Luke to the women to the driver, who was already snapping reins. "Any papers say who claims who?" he asked. Luke handed over the boarding letter. Ames read, thumb underlining as he went. "Eleanor Pike," he said, more to himself than to Luke. "Abilene to Dry Willow. Fees paid. Sponsor, Calder." He looked at the women's sheet, turned it sideways, then righted it again, helpless as any plainsman lost in ink he couldn't read. "Names here?" He touched the characters carefully. Leon's mouth tightened, then softened. She placed a finger by one column and sounded something like a bell without a church. "Leon." Then she tapped her sisters. "May." "Shu." She didn't try to translate. She just offered the truth of what they called one another. Ames blew out a slow breath. "Well," he said, "we'll get more thunder than water out of this if we stand here." Luke, Their paper points to you. Not the names you were promised, but the place you wrote. I'm not in the business of turning folks into the sagebrush because a clerk smudged a ledger. Henderson's eyebrows climbed. You mean to let him take 3? That'll light a sermon. Ames didn't look at him. My badge has a star, not a steeple. He turned to Luke. You can house them a night while we sort it. You can take them on to the mission at Belfort if you won't. But don't leave them on a platform while men decide their freight. The women understood none of the words and all of the temperature. Leanne watched Luke, not the sheriff. May shifted the box closer with her foot, quick glance at the driver as if she expected hands reaching. Shue stood still as a measured breath. Luke looked down the road toward Willow Draw. He saw the blue roof he'd hammered last winter with his own awkward hands. He saw his churn, his empty chair, the table set for one like a joke that had gone stale. He saw what the town would do with 3 shadows on his porch. He put his palm flat to his chest, the simplest sign he could think to make, and said, Come. Something eased in Leon's shoulders. Not relief exactly, but the slack a rope gives when it's taken a load and means to carry it. The 3 gathered their satchels. Jus lifted the lacquer box and hugged it close. May gave a small, quick bow to the sheriff that read like thanks in any language. They walked. It was a peculiar procession. A rancher who had expected one small Eastern wife and received a puzzle, 3 women who had crossed half a country without the tool of its words, and a town craning to see whether decency looked like foolishness when the sun hit it from the wrong side. Ames tipped his hat once, enough to claim the moment as witnessed, then stepped back into the shade where the law does most of its work. They passed Widow Malley. She sniffed, then, after a blink's war with herself, thrust a wrapped heel of yesterday's bread at May. May took it with both hands and bowed again, the motion so graceful it made the gesture look larger than it was. 2 boys quit their gawking and ran to chase a lizard, as boys will when kindness confuses them. On the road, Luke slowed his step to their pace. The cottonwoods put chipped lace shadows across the dust. A hawk wrote its lazy S in the sky. The women spoke in quick threads, sometimes touching fingers to count or measure. Twice, Shue looked back. Twice, Leanne said something that steadied her. May walked in the middle with the box, eyes everywhere at once. At the creek ford, Leanne stopped and pointed at the water. She mimed washing hands, then looked at Luke for permission. He nodded. They knelt and cupped clear cold into their palms, brushed trail grit from cheeks and wrists, dabbed water on their necks. May removed a tiny comb from her sleeve, and in 3 fast moves, straightened a stray lock behind Shue's ear. Sisters, Luke thought. Not by ink, by everything that matters. Willow Draw sat where it always had, in the small cup of land between 2 low rises, a house with a weary porch and a barn that needed nails, a windmill that creaked like a tired song. The women took it in the way you look at a horse you mean to ride, not with wonder, but with assessment. Shade here, barrel there, fence mended in that corner first. Luke opened the door. The air inside smelled like cut wood and coffee that had gone old waiting. He stood aside. Leanne hesitated, then crossed the threshold. May followed, turning to set the lacquer box gently on the table, as if it were a person asked to sit. Shue came last, touching the doorframe with 2 fingers as she passed, a private gesture for luck or memory. Luke pointed at the table, then at himself, then at each of them in turn. Eat, he said and mimed bread. Water. He poured. He set plates. It felt like trying to tune a fiddle with gloves on. They watched, then mirrored. Hands open, small nods. Yes to the air. The house changed its sound. Outside, somewhere back toward town, a rumor found legs and started to run. Inside, 3 women who did not share his words looked at Luke with a mixture of caution and hope, and a man who had asked for 1 life realized the door had opened to 3. He didn't know yet about the men who would come asking questions not fit to answer, or the maps tucked beneath the lacquer box lining, or the way work done in silence can braid people into something stronger than paper. He only knew he had said come, and they had. The rest, like weather, would have to be met as it arrived. That first night, the house sounded like it never had before. Not louder, just different. Where Luke once heard only wind against the shutters, now there was the faint creak of floorboards under careful steps, The rustle of fabric as someone spread a blanket on the loft. The soft whisper of a language he could not follow. He gave them his bed and set himself on a cot in the corner. They did not protest, maybe could not, but their eyes met his with a weight that said they understood the trade. When he doused the lamp, their silhouettes lingered against the glow of the stove, three outlines bending together like trees in a wind only they could feel. Morning brought work. Luke found Leon already outside, hauling a pail from the well. Her arms flexed under the weight, but her face was calm, eyes scanning the yard as if to measure its strengths and faults. May was kneeling by the doorstep, folding the quilt she had used and beating the dust from it with precise, practiced strokes. Shu crouched at the hearth, coaxing flame from yesterday's coals with the same determination Luke had once seen in men driving cattle through snow. He watched a moment before stepping forward. "Coffee," he said, pointing at the pot. "Bread." He broke a loaf, set it on the table. They gathered, hands folded before touching the food, small nods exchanged among themselves. Gratitude even if no words passed. In town, whispers had already galloped ahead of him. By noon, a man who had ordered one bride was said to be harboring three strangers with no English. Henderson shook his head behind the counter, muttering about mistakes, about how the agency would answer for it. Two men outside the blacksmith spat tobacco and laughed about 3 for the price of 1. Luke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He bought nails, flour, a new axe handle, and left. When he returned, Ruth Malley was waiting at his fence, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. 3 foreign girls in your house, she said, her voice sharp as frost. You'll draw trouble like flies. Luke leaned against the rail, eyes steady. They're under my roof. That's all anyone needs to know. She sniffed and walked on, skirts swishing dust. But Luke knew it wouldn't end there. Back inside, May placed a small wooden comb on the table. She pushed it gently toward him, then tapped her own chest. Her meaning was clear enough. Thank you. Luke picked it up, felt the smooth grain, nodded once. No words were needed. That evening, while the sun slid behind the cottonwoods, Shu stood by the window, watching the road, shoulders stiff, eyes narrowed. Leon joined her, rested a hand on her arm. Whatever haunted them was still out there. Luke felt it then. The story had only just begun, and it was bigger than any mistake in a boarding ledger. They came on the second afternoon, when heat pressed the yard flat and cicadas worked like saws in the cottonwoods. 2 riders and a third on a mule with saddlebags that clinked. The lead man wore a coat too fine for the county and a smile that tried to be neighborly and landed on hungry. The second had the shoulders of a freight hauler and the eyes of somebody who likes finding things that aren't his. The mule man kept his hat low and said nothing. Luke met them at the gate. Behind him, the house door stood half open. Inside, the scrape of a chair stopped. He felt the shift of air the way cattle do before a storm. Afternoon, the fine coat said, reins loose, voice smooth. Name's Dillard. My associates and I have business from the Abilene agency. Heard there was a mix-up out this way. His gaze flicked past Luke toward the porch. 3 young ladies, foreign extraction, arrived where only one was expected. Mix-up's what we're calling it, Luke said. Sheriff knows they're here. Course he does. Dillard kept smiling. We aim to square it. Agency sent us to collect the girls and carry them on proper. Whole thing's a misunderstanding. Paperwork got twisted. Routes got crossed. He spread his hands to show how innocent a tangle can be. Luke had been a hand long enough to know when a man's palms lied. You got papers with their names? Papers? Dillard chuckled as if the word were a joke. The muleman's saddlebags chimed softly in the pause. What matters is the agency's authority. We'll see him safe. He leaned a little in the saddle. You don't want that kind of responsibility on your place, friend. Folks talk. They already do. Luke didn't move from the gate. If you've got names, show 'em. If you've got a sheriff's order, show that instead. The hauler swung down as if to stretch, big boots raising dust. He let his eyes roam the porch like a hand that hadn't decided what to take. We can make this friendly, he said without looking at Luke. Friendly would have been yesterday, Luke said, before you rode onto my land unasked. Inside the house, a board creaked. Leon and her sisters would be standing just beyond the line of light, listening. He could almost feel their eyes on his back. Dillard's smile thinned. Now, No call to make this sour. Agency loses money every hour those girls sit in the wrong county. You got brought into a business matter that doesn't belong on your ledger. You came to the wrong ranch if you carry people like Coin, Luke said, calm because heat has no use for fast words. He set his thumb against the gatepost in a way that settled his own pulse. Sheriff Ames will be here if you wired him. You did wire him. Dillard traded a look with the mule man. The fellow's jaw worked once, twice, no answer. Tell you what, Dillard said, we'll step into the shade, have a drink, talk sense. You hand the girls over quiet, and I'll see you're not out whatever fee you mailed east. Man shouldn't pay twice for the same mistake. The hauler had drifted toward the porch as if he'd been blown there. His hand touched the rail. Inside, something small slid across wood, the sound a careful person makes when she backs farther from a door. Luke folded his arms on the top rail. Gate's where we're talking. He let his eyes fall to the hauler's wrist, to the pale scar where a rope had once burned a circle. He kept his voice easy. You don't cross that because I told you, and because my neighbor's watching from his hayloft, and because Sheriff's been known to ride the draw at odd times when fancy men aim to solve things quick? Dillard finally let the smile go. The heat took it and left something sharper. You set yourself against the agency, you set yourself against folks with reach, he said, not loud but flat. These girls signed contracts, passage, placement, repayment. You know how debts work. Not when signatures don't match the faces, Luke said. Not when a man rides in with clinking saddlebags and no names in his mouth. The mule man shifted, and the bag mouths winked open enough for Luke to see glint. Not Coin, exactly. Something flatter. He thought suddenly of the lacquered box on his table, how Shu had set it like a heartbeat. He felt a line draw in the dust. Whatever business this was, it wasn't just wives and fees. Dillard reached into his coat and produced a paper neat as church linen. Here, he said, as if proving he had always meant to. The page bore columns of typed names and stamped seals. Consignment list, oriental placement marched across the top. Luke read enough to feel his stomach turn. No Leon, no May, no Shu. Only numbered initials and destination towns that didn't know they were listed. Not their names, Luke said. It's how the agency keeps order, Dillard said. Easier on the clerks. Easier on men who don't want to answer for a person with a name, Luke said. He lifted his eyes. You won't be taking anyone today. The hauler's jaw bunched. Maybe you don't get a choice. Maybe I do, came a voice from the lane. Sheriff Ames rode up without hurry, because a man who rushes to a fight has already lost pieces of it. Dust coated his boots. Sunlight laid a stripe across his badge. He took in the three strangers, the open gate, Luke's stillness, the house's quiet. Afternoon, Dillard, Ames said, like he was greeting a man he'd met once and didn't need to again. You carry a court order? Agency authority, Dillard said, that smile trying to find its legs again. Ain't a court. Ames held out a hand. Let me see what you do have. Dillard passed the sheet. Ames read slower than his reputation, tracing lines with a finger that had broken twice. He looked up. This paper is not fit to claim a crate of bolts, let alone 3 people. He folded it once, twice, slid it into his vest. You want it back, you ask a judge with a seal whose ink isn't still drying in some rail agent's back room. Dillard kept his voice pleasant, but the corners of it were gone. Sheriff, you overstep. I step where the law stands, Ames said, and where my town sleeps at night. He angled his horse so its shoulder closed the lane and looked at the hauler. Get off Mr. Calder's rail. The hauler removed his hand as if he'd touched stove iron. The mule man's bag settled with a tired jingle. Ames turned his head just enough for Luke to see the other thing in his eyes. Be ready anyway. He nodded toward the porch once, a small sign for whoever waited behind the door that the world still had decent men. Dillard shrugged like a man taking off a coat he planned to put back on later. No use burning daylight, he said lightly. We'll be in town a spell, Sheriff. If Mr. Calder reconsiders, you know where to send word. He gathered his reins. The hauler swung up. The mule man clicked his tongue. Before they turned, Dillard let his gaze touch the porch one more time, the way a wolf does not forget where it scented meat. They rode off, trailing dust. Ames watched until the road bent and the sound thinned. When they were gone, he blew out a breath he hadn't let them hear. "Won't be the last of it," he said, quiet near the gate. "They don't push that hard for a simple refund." "I figured," Luke said. "The girls?" "Safe as this county can make 'em," Ames said. "Safer if you keep your lanterns low at night and your shotgun nearer than habit." He nodded toward the house. "You learned their names?" "Leon, May, Shu," Luke said, feeling how good it was to say them out loud where the son could hear. Ames tipped his hat like a small oath. "That helped," he said. He looked at the wind, then back. "I'll put a word to the Telegraph about Dillard and his list. Might not stop a thing, but it sets a marker. Come morning, I'll ride by." He turned his horse. "And Luke, keep that gate shut unless you mean to open it." When the sheriff was a shape among cottonwoods, Luke went to the porch. The door edged inward. Leon stood there with the lacquered box in her arms, May behind her with a kettle, Shu to the side with eyes still fixed on the lane, as if she could hold danger in place by watching it. Luke lifted his hands empty, palms forward, the sign he had learned they read without trouble. "All right," he said softly. "For now." Leon looked at the road, then at him. She nodded once and set the box back on the table, like a promise renewed. May reached for the dipper. Shu finally blinked and let her shoulders down a little. The house breathed again. Evening slid in on long shadows. Luke checked the barn doors twice, then a third time. He set a chair under the latch of the back door, not because he believed chairs stop wickedness, but because doing something sits better than waiting. He banked the fire low. The sisters moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, the kind that turns fear into tasks. When night took the yard, the planes opened their book of sounds. Crickets, a far coyote, the small tick of wood cooling. Somewhere between those notes, Luke heard something else. 3 women breathing in the next room, the rhythm steadying like a team hitting the same stride. He lay on his cot and watched the dark until it had no edges, thinking of Dillard's list and of names spoken like bells. Sleep came late. Before it did, Luke reached up to the shelf and set his old ring box beside the lamp, where morning would find it. Promises were changing shape in his house. So were threats. He would meet both with his hands open and his gate shut. Days steadied into rhythm, though every knock of hoof on the road made Luke's pulse hitch. The sisters worked without needing to be told. Leon carried buckets from the well, like she had always known the path. May learned to mix bread with the same precision she folded cloth. Shu kept the stove burning and the yard swept. They spoke little he could understand, but their actions drew a map clearer than words. One evening, after the herd was in and the sun had given the sky to embers, Luke found Leon at the table with the lacquered box. The red cord lay untied, careful as prayer. She glanced at him once, then lifted the lid. Inside were thin papers covered in script he couldn't read, and beneath them a folded sheet in English. She pushed that one toward him. Luke set his hands flat before he touched it, the way a man does when he knows something will change the room. The paper was a shipping invoice, dated 6 months back, stamped with the same agency seal he had seen in Dillard's false list. Consignment, 3 female, destination, Dry Willow, sponsor, Calder. His name plain as fence posts, though he had never signed. His throat dried. "They meant for you to come here," he said softly. "Not Eleanor Pike. Me." Leon's eyes held his, steady and unreadable, then dropped to the papers. She touched one line with her finger, then pressed that finger against her own chest. May and Shu echoed the gesture, silent but certain. Whatever ink had been used, they had been carried across half a continent to stand in his yard. Luke leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The truth was a fence too high to jump. If the agency had tied his name to their transport, then Dillard hadn't been lying about debts, only about whose pockets they lined. The sisters were not mistake nor accident. They had been promised into someone's hand, and the slip of paper made that hand his. He looked at Leon. "You think I signed this?" he said. She didn't answer, but her silence was heavier than denial. A knock broke the air. 3 quick raps, like a man who believes the door already his. Luke stood, heart climbing, and opened it to find Henderson, hat in hand, sweat on his neck. "Luke," he said, voice hushed though no one else was near. "You best know, Dillard's still in town. Spent the day buying drinks for every loudmouth in the saloon, telling how you're keeping what he calls his property. Folks are chewing it like gristle. Some say you're hiding trouble. Some say you're sitting on gold. All say it won't sit quiet much longer. Luke thanked him and shut the door. Behind him, the sisters had gathered close, eyes on his face. He forced calm into his voice. "They'll come again," he said, "but this time we won't be surprised." Leon closed the box, retied the red cord, and set it back on the table with both hands. Not like a burden, like a weapon yet to be drawn. That night, Luke laid his rifle across the rafters and kept the lantern trimmed low. The prairie stretched silent, but in his bones he knew it. The storm hadn't passed. It was circling. The storm came with hooves. Near dawn, before the first rooster, Luke heard it. The clatter of horses across frozen ground. The echo of men too eager to hide their noise. He was already at the window with his rifle when Dillard's voice rang out, thick with ale and arrogance. "Whitfield, hand 'em over. You know damn well they ain't yours." Luke opened the door but stayed in the frame, rifle easy in his arms. Behind him, the sisters stood in the shadows, their dark hair braided, eyes fixed on him like hinges on a door. He spoke plain. "They're not yours either, Dillard. Paper or no paper. They're people." Dillard spat into the dirt. Two men flanked him, faces hard, guns loose at their belts. "I paid good coin, and the law'll back me. You want to fight the law?" Luke leveled the rifle, not shaking. "The law don't ride with men who steal women off wagons. Not here." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Leon stepped from the cabin, barefoot on cold planks. Her hand rested on Luke's shoulder, not timid, not asking, steadying him. She said something in her language, voice low but sharp as a blade. Dillard sneered, though the edge of his grin faltered. May and Shu followed her, each holding tools from the yard. A hatchet, a hoe. Not weapons made for war, but gripped like they meant to be. They stood beside Luke, not behind. Dillard's men shifted uneasily. They hadn't ridden out to face a wall of resolve. They'd come for spoils, for a quiet grab. Now they saw a rancher with his back ironed straight and three women who would not be carried off screaming. "You'll regret this," Dillard muttered, reins jerking as he wheeled his horse. "Every man in Dry Willow will hear what you've done." "Let 'em," Luke called after him. "I'd rather they hear the truth." The riders vanished in dust and frost, leaving silence thick enough to choke. Luke lowered his rifle, breath leaving him in a long stream. Leanne's hand was still on his shoulder. He turned, met her eyes. Something passed there. Trust, fragile as glass, but real. Days stretched again, but different now. Neighbors kept their distance, some whispering, some watching. Henderson came by with sacks of flour and left without asking payment. A quiet nod said enough. Word had spread, but not everyone swallowed Dillard's bile. Luke mended fences with Leon beside him, her hands strong as his. May learned the rhythm of baking in his kitchen, filling the house with scents no one in Dry Willow had tasted. Shu planted herbs by the porch, bowing to the soil like prayer. Their laughter, rare but rising, cracked the silence of his land. One evening, when the sky burned copper, Leon pressed a folded paper into his hand. Not the invoice, something else. A letter written carefully in English, words traced slow but certain. "We stay, if you want us to." Luke read it twice, then a third time, heart stumbling. He looked at her, at May, at Shu, faces weary from travel, scarred by loss, yet lit with a steadiness he hadn't known his ranch could hold. He set the paper down, slow as laying a cornerstone. "Then stay," he said, voice rough but sure. And for the first time since he'd sent away for a bride who never came, Luke Whitfield did not feel alone.